From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers, and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host Jason Schie and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform best practice in whole school mental health. Jason, I think that you're in Perth and I'm in Victoria. We're both at home for a change, but I know our guest, Lisa, is traveling. I'm going to introduce Lisa, who is a fellow Vancouver Islander. Lisa, where are you this week?
Well, like you said, normally home is Victoria, like you, but today I'm joining you from Yellowknife, which is Northwest Territories. So the northern part of Canada. It's pretty cool. It actually was snowy here this morning and exciting to be up in the Great White North.
Jason, I don't think you get very much of that white stuff where you are, do you?
No, I was saying off air, it'd be one of the signs of the apocalypse, I think, if it ever snowed in Perth. Doesn't really get below 10 degrees Celsius here in Perth, even in the middle of winter.
Wow.
So I have met Lisa before. Jason, this is your first time chatting with Lisa. Lisa lives on the island with me, and yet we only seem to be able to connect when we're at a conference or recording a podcast. Lisa, I'm going to say what I know about you, because I think you are absolutely amazing. You have been a teacher for 20 years. You're a facilitator, a counselor. You're a mom. You've written a fabulous book called Self-Compassion for Educators. And you have your whole own method, the Method, Awakening Wellbeing for Educators. And if that's not enough, you work with wonderful beings like Kristen Neff and Karen Bluth, all around mindfulness and self-compassion. You're my hero. I think I need a little bit of what you're selling right now.
Thank you. It's such a privilege to be able to hold all those roles. And, I've been an educator for 20 years, but the last 15, no, maybe 13, I've been a school counselor. So I've also worked really closely one-on-one with kids, which has also been important in holding the teachers, right? So in that role is to support children, but I found often I was also working very closely with educators. And it was a big part of my desire to talk about educator well-being, to talk about teacher well-being, because I saw how much we're seeing the teachers struggling. And it's been a big journey that I've been on for over a decade.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. So you've been doing it for a decade, but maybe in just a few minutes, Lisa, maybe sum up what has brought you to this point?
Yeah, I think, I was always loved teaching teachers. So I've always had a lean towards supporting the adults around that I've been working with. I love kids, and I went into education because, I love relationships, and education and teaching is about relationships. But about 8 years ago, I really noticed, especially in BC at the time in education, how much teachers were struggling. We had a September where our BC public school teachers went on strike. And I don't know, I know in Australia, new school year starts in January, but in North America, our new school year starts in September. And, New Year's are pretty, you're sharpening your pencils, you're getting your new shoes, you're getting your clothes, you're ready to go back to school. And we didn't go back. And we were staying out to fight for better class size, better class composition, really trying to support what whole school would look like to support our students. And we were not an unpaid strike, right? Like this was walking a picket line for 3 weeks. And we ended up going back, not settling for anything and feeling really disgruntled and defeated after that. And I remember going into I was counseling at the time and seeing a lot of kids who were also feeling really undervalued and underappreciated. And I was seeing this correlation. And I know Tamara loves research and data points. And I wish I had taken some at the time, because I noticed, when the kids were coming in, they were coming from teachers' classrooms who were also really struggling. And I started to realize, when our adults are not well, we see this filter down to our kids. And I think what was the most important about this, or most significant for me, is that my kids were just about to start school into this public school system the year after. And so I often say I started this work more as a mom than as a teacher. As a teacher, I knew that there was a lot of problems in our system. But as a mom, I thought, who's going to raise my babies? How do I send them into a system where I need to make sure that people will care for them and love them? And feel well in that place. And so I've been sort of standing on any rooftop I could since then, really saying, how do we prioritize that educator well-being is a foundational part of whole school well-being?
Yeah. And look, I think that's so important. Tamara and I have spoken about it on previous episodes of the podcast about how it really does take a whole school approach. You do see people go, well, it's the kids that are the product of school. And so a lot of investment goes into student wellbeing. But like you say, if you don't start with staff wellbeing, it's very difficult to get the student wellbeing right.
Yeah. And I was told that directly. I remember the first few years of me doing this work and running retreats and running workshops and just any grassroots movement I could do, I was doing. And I was having senior leaders saying, like, we're in the business of kids. If you can change your language to be about the kids, then we'll invite you in to speak. But because you're talking about the teachers, it's not valuable to us. And I was like, I just didn't see how they couldn't see that correlation. And it drove me crazy. And so I continued to fight for, prioritizing educator well-being. And because really, yes, it's about the kids, and yes, we're in the business of kids, but the kids keep going through, and who stays? It is the educators who are creating the culture and the system in schools. And so we need to make sure that if you want, I often say, I started for my kids, well, they're in middle school now, they're grade 6 and 7. I'll be lucky if by the time they graduate, we see any culture shift. So that's 14 years of me continuing to do this work, because that's how long it takes to create system change.
Lisa, I can understand why Tamara wanted you on the podcast. I'm looking forward to you shouting from this rooftop.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk.
So Lisa, one parable that I often use when I'm talking to people who maybe don't understand our work exactly comes from a public health parable. And you may have heard it before, and I know some of our audience may have heard it, but I'm going to tell you this parable and ask you where you see your work sitting. So this is a parable that we're at a park beside a river, rolling river, and all of a sudden we hear screams of a child going down the river. And of course, the adults at the side of the river dive in and save that child, and they're getting that child out. And just as they get the first child out, they hear another one, and then another one, and another one. And eventually somebody goes upstream and looks to see why the children are falling into the river. So whether we're talking children or students, where do you see your work sitting in that parable?
Oh, I mean, I am upstream. I started upstream, right? Like I am up there saying, hey, what are we doing so that the kids don't fall in? What are we doing? So, and really about how are we making sure that the educators are holding these kids so that they don't fall in, right? That's where I think I am, is if we want our kids to be well, if we really want them, they need to regulate. We want our kids to tolerate distressing emotions. We want our kids to problem solve and to go through challenging situations. Like, it's okay that they fall in. Let's be honest. What we want them to do is actually send them into the water with a life jacket, because our teachers know how to put them on for them, right? Like, I'm changing your whole metaphor here a little bit, but I think that we worry about kids' mental health, and we should. But what we don't worry about is the fact that they need to learn to co-regulate with a calm and regulated adult. And what we're seeing in our world these days is our adults aren't regulated. They don't know how to calm their own nervous system down. They don't know how to, manage their own emotions. So they're either, very overwhelmed and very stressed, or they're okay. And they're, so there's sort of no in between. And what we want to do really is give them all life jackets so that if they fall in, they're not sinking, because we can't avoid the river.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And in fact, that's one thing that we really want to get across in this podcast as well. It really takes an integrated approach. It's not all the upstream stuff. It's not all the downstream stuff. It's not all the in the middle with the life jackets in the river. It's a bit of everything, right? But in particular, as Tamara mentioned, like one of the areas that you focus on is on around self-compassion. Mm-hmm. So tell us what drew you to working in that area.
Yeah, thank you. So I had a background in counseling psychology, a master's in counseling psychology. And I often say I finished my whole master's in counseling psychology and didn't once learn about positive psychology. And then I finished and was thinking, like, why are we just getting kids to be okay? Like, why aren't we getting them to flourish, to thrive? How are we getting them better? And I started to do I often call it my second master's in positive psychology. I dove into everything I could find. I really just, felt really called to learning about how do we help people move beyond just being okay. And part of that big practice was around finding my own mindfulness practice or deepening my mindfulness practice. And I started teaching a lot of work around mindfulness for educators. And we were training educators, and lots of times when you ask teachers how to or what they want, they say, give me tools for my classroom. And I was a big believer, like, if you want to teach mindfulness to kids, then you need to know it for yourself. And so we were teaching, how do you teach mindfulness? By knowing it yourself. And as I was doing that, I was realizing teachers were still struggling. Like, mindfulness is the practice of, paying attention, and paying attention didn't always feel good. And we didn't want to sit in that. And during that journey, I was thinking about, my own practice around mindfulness. And what I really loved was always the loving kindness, was the practice of meeting myself with care and kindness. And I did some more research and discovered the practices of self-compassion, Dr. Kristen Neff and Dr. Chris Germer's work. And so I went and did my own training, and I thought, well, I want to learn more about this. And the minute I started getting trained in this work, I realized what a foundational practice this was for anybody who's a caregiver, parents, educators, teachers, because what it does, it gives us permission to, recognize that it's hard and, be okay with it and treat that practice with kindness. So, to have that mindfulness piece, to be aware of it, but not to get so caught up in it that we can't meet and care for ourselves in the process. And I thought it was just what teachers need, what educators need is beyond just knowing, it's actually embodying this practice of like compassionate care for self, because we're really good at giving it to everybody else. But this invitation to learn how to bring it back has been life-changing for me personally. And every time I share it, I see these huge shifts with educators and them going, thank you, that's just what I needed.
Yeah, I got to say, unlike Tamara, I don't really have a mindfulness practice, or at least not a formal mindfulness practice. I do practice informal mindfulness from time to time. But the first time I heard about loving kindness, mindfulness or meditation was through Laurie Santos on her Happiness Lab podcast. And yeah, I was interested. So yeah, there's quite a good evidence base behind it. So yeah, it's great that you can bring that to people and teach them how to practice that self-compassion using that method.
Yeah. And I just want to say, I think that's part of the reason that I liked it too. It wasn't just woo-woo. Like the research that Kristen Neff has done, there's a lot of evidence that's showing it grows your resilience, it lowers your stress, it increases your happiness and your optimism. And so that you're seeing that, data points have been showing that this is making a difference in people's lives. Well, let's bring that to educators.
I love that, Lisa. And I think it's interesting because you started talking about how this impacts the community, but then you ended on this takes your stress down. And I think one of the challenges when we hear self-compassion is that sometimes people think it is self-centered. So can you unpack a little bit about why that is not true? Yeah, that actually self-compassion is for the greater good. It's not just for the individual.
Yeah. Well, I think too, there's a lot of misgivings around self-compassion that, that it's weak or it's selfish or it's just being like giving ourselves pity, and there's a lot of research that says actually, the more we recognize that, we're caring for ourselves in a really caring way, we're able to support other people. So, it's, self-compassion is that putting your own oxygen mask on first. It's saying, I care about myself enough that I'm going to show up so that I have the, ability to show up for other people. It's not indulgent. It's not just saying like, oh, I'm kind to myself, I'll do whatever I want, right? Like we want people to recognize there's a real strength in self-compassion. It's saying, how do I deeply care for myself? And what does this one need? In self-compassion, we often ask the question, what do I need right now? And lots of teachers don't know how to answer that because we're so good at meeting everybody else's needs that we haven't taken the time to care for ourselves and wonder, and what do I need? And it's not it's not just self-care, right? Like, I just want to differentiate that. Like, self-compassion and self-care are different. Self-care, when done intentionally to relieve suffering, is the behavioral practice of self-compassion. It's the doing part of it. But, when we are constantly in a busy system of school and, we're overwhelmed, we can't, be in the middle of a classroom and a kid throws a chair across the classroom. We can't be like, I just need to go practice self-care, right? Like, you can't say, I'm out for now, I'm going to go get a massage. We have a responsibility to be with these kids, but we can be like, oh, this is hard. Like, I'm noticing that this is difficult, and I'm going to slow down and meet myself with a bit of kindness so I can calm my own nervous system. So then I can be with this kid and all the other little ones who need my presence right now. And it's our presence that is our greatest gift when we're working with our kids.
Oh, yeah, you are so spot on. And I think post-COVID, we've kind of lost that a little bit with this whole burnout thing that's overwhelming.
Totally. And I was like, teachers were overwhelmed and tired before COVID. Like, I was doing these talks before COVID, and then you throw a global pandemic in where, and teachers showed up and they adapted and they switched and they changed and they continued to give. And they weren't always met with the same, value and support. They really need to be cared for. And, the practice of self-compassion says this one, I care for me. But what it does is that actually creates a circular, like, the more I care for myself and support myself, the more I'm able to give compassion outward. And so the more we invite our leaders to practice empathy and compassion, the more we see them being able to respond with their colleagues, the more our educators practice for themselves, the more they're able to be compassionate and caring for their kids, the more the kids, it's amazing the circle of compassion that can grow when we include ourselves in that circle.
Yeah, Lisa, given that we've got someone with a fair bit of expertise around self-compassion, clearly you would have seen some things that work and some things that don't. But for our listeners interested in maybe trying some self-compassion or developing a self-compassion practice, can you give them maybe one tip that works well?
Totally. And, a lot of when we start practicing self-compassion, it's hard because what happens is our inner critic gets in the way, right? Like that like, oh, I'm not good enough, I can't do this. I'm asking you to be kind to yourself, but you're like, also all the reasons I can't be kind to myself come up, right? Like, we sort of invite this warmth, and now all the reasons why I don't deserve it start to approach. And so just an invitation to go really slow when you're practicing self-compassion. It's not a like jump in the deep end and all of a sudden everything's, rosy and unicorns and perfect and wonderful. In fact, what I would say is the first step would be starting to notice how you're feeling and just meet every time something is hard with a bit of just like, oh yeah, it's hard. Like, giving yourself permission to be a human being that feels messy sometimes. And so this intentionality around some common humanity is really valuable, especially for teachers. The other thing I'll say is start to see if you can talk to yourself the way you would talk to your best friend, your students, your colleagues. We say things to ourselves that we would never, ever say out loud to anybody else. It's really amazing how dark and negative we can treat ourselves. And yet, think about saying that to my own daughter, and it's like my heart breaks. I would never say those things. So just that shift of like, can you talk to yourself the way you might talk to your best friend, because you deserve it too, right? There's this permission that you get to care for yourself. And so starting really small with just noticing, paying attention to when things are hard, and just offering a bit of warmth. One of the easiest practices is like just actually physically putting a hand on your heart. Sorry, excuse me. And actually, sorry, go ahead.
I was noticing you do that throughout our conversation, that you often rest your hands in your heart center. And I know that Karen Bluth, when she worked with our team at Geelong Grammar, one of the things that she said is sometimes you don't have the headspace to be in your head, but just by putting a hand gently, that physical comfort is a shortcut that works for me when I can't stop that voice in my head.
Yeah, you're probably doing a fair bit of that when your tech was failing you before this podcast recording.
The heart.
I use it all the time.
If I notice you patting yourself, Jay, I'll say that we need a little break.
It's usually just I'm playing with my beard, but yeah.
But if you think of a parent when they're soothing a kid, what do? They're rocking, they're holding their, we soothe our little ones all the time. We forget that we can self-soothe. Like just the simple practice of, and I do it all the time because anytime I feel myself getting a little energetic, it's such a reminder to offer warmth. And so, we can say that to teachers. Sometimes it lands really well. Just a hand to your heart as a reminder of just feeling the warmth, and then, take a breath and invite some gentle steps, like just go slow. I think that's probably the biggest advice we can give educators right now is you have permission to slow down and you have permission to be kind to yourself.
Yeah. And sometimes I need that permission, right? Because during the pandemic, there's a lot of focus on the health workers, and look, rightfully so. But teachers were right up there on the front lines with them, right? They were still being asked to go to school, even though the rest of the workforces were like told stay at home and work from home. They had to adapt.
Aren't safe, but let's put 30 kids together in a classroom, right?
Yeah.
And then nobody was out banging pots and pans. I don't know if this happened, Jason, in Perth, but where Lisa and I live, every night at 7:00, people went out on their front porch and banged pots and pans. Nobody was doing that for the teachers. I love that we supported the healthcare workers. Don't take anything away from them, but we have gone really far on our teacher support. I even think when, we do a little course called Parent Teacher Interviews Done Right. And one of the biggest shifts that teachers tell us they've heard in a parent teacher interview is that the parents take the student's side in everything. And so there's almost this gang up effect. And I think that's evident in our lack of celebrating how much those teachers showed up for our kids during that pandemic, that we weren't there for them. And so you understand how self-compassion is hard when they're not getting compassion, let alone self-compassion.
Totally. And you can understand why they're verging on burnout.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that lack of support, that lack of recognition for what they've done, gone above and beyond. And just think about how much change, right? The way we do school hasn't changed much. I know Tamara and people like you, Lisa, have been pushing for like changes to how we do schooling for a while. Took a pandemic to automatically then go, oh crap, if this is going to continue, we need to start doing this online. How does that work? And teachers had to bear the brunt of all of that change all at once when, as an industry, education has been very resistant to change.
Totally. And I just have to say too, like one of the things we know that's best in education is that, we try and create as individual plan for as many kids as possible. We know that no one learner is the same thing, learns the same way. So we try and individualize as much as we can. And yet we treat educators all the same, and I think that if we can start recognizing that, no one educator also needs the same thing. We often see, schools thinking, I have a well-being program. I offered yoga after school, or, I do these things that are one-offs for well-being. And yet, that's not going to land for each and every educator. What the reason I like self-compassion is it says, what do I need right now? Right? Like sometimes my wellness needs me to get out and go for a walk and get some physical activity. Sometimes my wellness says, actually, I need to go connect with somebody because I'm feeling really isolated and I need some connection time. Sometimes my wellness says I need to go meditate. On a given day, my wellness plan is different. And yet we ask educators, like, if you could just all do this at the same time, it's the opposite of what we ask in education. So it's so important that we give them the space to answer that question. What do I need to support my well-being?
And Lisa, look, I totally agree with that. And I know we're talking mainly about teachers and school staff members today, but I see the same problem with students. Like, we're going to, as a cohort or as a forum group, we're going to teach them all mindfulness practice. Even though that might not go down well, or not every student will want to adopt a mindfulness practice. There's not, we like you said, we're learning. We need to individualize our academic plans at a student level as much as possible, and not treat all of them like widgets, or they're in a factory and we're just going to keep producing them the same way. We need to do the same with wellbeing as well. We can't just give them all the same practice and expect everyone's going to benefit from it or use it.
100%. And I think what works, my personal opinion of what works best in schools is we give them lots of opportunity to try different things so they can figure out what works and what doesn't. And the biggest way they learn is when it's modeled. So, if I teach mindfulness, but, Jason, you come in and you've got some great physical literacy program, and, Tamara's coming in and she's doing some incredible work on nutrition. The kids are going to get different pieces from where they are, but they're also going to see someone who really authentically loves what they do and knows it. It's a real strength-based place around social emotional learning. And the more we model these things as educators, then we are able to help kids see that, no one of us is unique or the same. We're all unique. We're going to respond to situations in different ways. So as a classroom teacher, when I'm, totally stressed out and I'm in the middle of a crazy day, like I said, a kid throws a chair across the classroom, I'm actually saying to my kids, oh, wow, that was really hard. I'm noticing for myself right now that my chest is racing because that was hard for all of us to see. I wonder if collectively we could take a deep breath, slow everything down for a few minutes. It's going to help me in this moment, and it might help you too. Like we're modeling what we need to do, and we can't do that if we don't know how to do that. And I think this is where that practice of, not telling you have to teach this curriculum if it doesn't land with you is really not the best thing we can do for any student and for any teacher.
Yeah. Totally agree. And recently I read a study where they tried to do mindfulness practice in school, and it was a longitudinal follow-up for, I think it was about 7 years. And in the end, they found there was actually no impact. And a lot of it came down to you're forcing educators who don't have their own mindfulness-based practice. They don't believe in it. They're not comfortable teaching it to teach it to students. And so, getting people who actually are modeling it but want to model it because it's working for them, that's really important.
Well, you're speaking my language. Like that's the essence of, I run a year-long mindfulness program, and every part of that is saying you embody this practice yourself first. And before you ever teach it, really know how you can bring your full presence into your classroom and do it from the place that's very authentic to you. Because, and I've talked to people who've created some of those curriculums and they just try and share it. And I've seen teachers who get the curriculum of mindfulness put on the CD and then go do their attendance. And it's like, this is not authentic for kids. Kids smell authenticity. They know whether or not you are showing up from your full self. So if we want our kids to learn, which is what most educators do, then bring what's your strengths, what are you good at, what do you love, and be really authentic from a place of presence. And for some of us, that's mindfulness. But all of us can relate to this practice of like, and I get to be kind because it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so important. We can't just, force educators to take on practices that they're not comfortable with, let alone asking them to teach kids. I mean, you have a maths teacher who has gone to university to study maths and teaching because they like the topic, right? They didn't go to learn mindfulness. And then if they're being asked to deliver that in school as well, then probably not going to go down well. They're going to, like you say, the kids are going to smell the inauthenticity.
Yeah.
But look, one question I had for you, Lisa, is look, I'm the founder of a startup, and we talk about fast fails. We learn a lot by failing, and we try and do that as quickly as possible. So we learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible. But what's a lesson, I guess, that you've learned around self-compassion that didn't work?
Well, I think trying to invite someone before they're ready is a really, like we were just sort of saying, I don't ever want someone to come to this party that we're throwing if they're not ready for the party, right? Like I'd never want to enforce this practice. I never want to tell someone they have to. The other thing I've seen with self-compassion is sometimes people, they get caught up in it too quickly, and then they don't have the capacity to go, they get overwhelmed. And we don't ask our kids can't learn when they're overwhelmed. We also don't want our teachers overwhelmed. So if we're just starting this practice, don't jump into what's the hardest thing I'm working with in my life. So I'm all of a sudden in tears and overwhelmed. This is not safe for educators. It's not safe for anyone. So, I always say, like, when we're starting to do it, this, like, tiptoe into the shallow end of the pool, like just get your feet wet in it, go really slow, because the more you do it, the more it's going to get integrated into your body and into your experience. But, it's not something you can force and do quickly. It's a practice and it's long term. And so I think where I've struggled is I've tried to say like, everybody needs this, and then realize not everybody needs this. Or I've given a practice and not given the foundation of like safety with people. And I think that I've learned a lot around how to make sure people feel really safe when they do this, so that they, feel success, because this is what ultimately we all want to feel.
I think all three of us on this podcast can probably relate to that. I think we're all impatient. We know, there's things at work and we just want people to do it. So that's a good one, practicing patience and letting people come on at their own pace.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Lisa, you've given us 2 examples of what it looks like when things aren't working at school. You've talked about a student throwing a chair across the room. And so we know when things are going wrong, that would be an indicator. And of course, we see lots of other indicators of kids not being able to learn, test scores going down, teachers leaving the career. So we know what it looks like when it's going wrong. But if everybody in a school community was practicing self-compassion and it led them to feeling good and functioning well, they were flourishing, and you walked into a school, how would you know that this school was different? What do you think would be the indicators?
Well, I think from a place of self-compassion, if it's done at like a cultural level at a school where people are, well, first of all, you would just see people being kind to each other, right? Like they would recognize that nobody's perfect, that kids are still going to make mistakes, that teachers are going to have bad days, but people have enough compassion because of their, and empathy, that they can hold the space for the struggles. And I think that what happens is so many of us, don't want to feel other people's struggles and hurt. And so we negate it too quickly. And so to me, a flourishing school says, it's not perfect. There's no such thing. But a compassionate school says, we're trauma informed. We're aware that people struggle. We can hold the space. We can be fully present with this human. I'm not trying to solve or fix, because nobody needs fixing. We just need support and care and love. So you feel this kindness really amongst the colleagues that are working together, that they can communicate openly with each other, and that they are listening to their kids too. Because I think that this is then kids feel seen, valued, and heard too. And this is what we all want.
You are so spot on and so open-minded, curious, non-judgmental, kind, listening. These are all great indicators that things are going right. I love this. And I am taking a moment, because I always like to rush into the next thing, a self-compassionate moment. Honestly, just to thank you for sharing this. And I want to make sure that everybody listening knows that they can reach out to you, because you've got your book, Self-Compassion for Educators, that actually breaks these things down into steps. Because we've talked about a lot of concepts today, but I was thinking, if I'm the maths teacher that Jason was talking about, and Lisa says holding space, I'm not sure I know what it means to hold space. And so I think some of those concepts require a deeper dive than we can give the energy to today on this podcast.
Yeah, the book is a workbook. So there's practices in it, and it's really written in an accessible and easy way so that you can just pick it up. It's full of stories from teachers, including my own stories, but lots of other contributing teachers. And it's really made in a way to feel self-compassion as you're reading it. So please pick it up and please reach out. I love to go on this journey with all kinds of educators around the world.
Now, Lisa, I'm conscious that you have to go soon, but maybe you can do something that we ask all of our guests to do. And because people are listening to this on a podcast, maybe you can share, 1 or 2 podcasts that you're listening to at the moment, or have in the past, that you really recommend educators listen to. I'm a huge Brené Brown fan. I have to say it, I love her work. I love listening to her. I love Adam Grant. I love his work, and I love that podcast.
And then I'm kind of one of these, I'm also been listening to lots of business, like how to be a business person podcast, which is totally random from this, but Amy Porterfield and sort of that kind of like, how do we show up in a different lens? Because I'm also curious, I think we need to have other lens or learn in other ways. And I'm a lifelong learner. And so I'm always trying to figure out things in other ways too.
Yeah, great. I think every one of our guests are going to say Brené Brown and Adam Grant.
Those have been our top two from everyone.
Yeah. I actually, on the plane on the way here, I listened to her latest Dare to Lead with Adam Grant and Simon Sinek and her. And I was like, this is like the perfect trifecta. It was amazing.
Yeah, beautiful.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of a fabulous conversation and today's episode. So if you're listening and you want to watch, you can go over to the YouTube channel. And we also share snippets on our LinkedIn page, and we invite you to connect with me and Jason and with Lisa. All of us are on LinkedIn, and that is it for today. We will catch you on the next episode. And until then, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.